Good morning and happy Sunday. This is going to be very brief, but it is just a commentary of my remembering 9/11, which is today. But the 9/11 I will speak on was 9/11, 2001, when America was attacked. Now, I'm not sure how many people remember that day in particular, where they were, or what they may have been doing, because it's been 2 decades now. However, I remember vividly those in the New York and Washington, D.C. area, actually all over the world, but especially those two areas, will never forget because the attacks were so very close. Many have probably seen and absorbed many documentaries, movies, biopics, recollections from those eyewitnesses, first responders, and the offspring of those who perished during those attacks. I remember I had just maybe a few months started my career with Homeland Security, but at that time it was known as FPS, or the Federal Protective Service. I had arrived at work as I normally would, which was 3rd and M Street Southeast, also known as the Navy Yard. That now has changed. That whole entire area has changed and built up many homes, bars, and restaurants. But at that time, it was the old Navy Yard that housed the Federal Protective Service. My supervisor, with whom I still keep in close contact with, would always be the first to arrive and the last to leave. I think a lot of his work ethic and acumen rubbed off on me. He was the special agent in charge, so he had to make sure everything was in place prior to everyone arriving. That particular morning, he already had his coffee and his monitor on. I had already made my Starbucks run and started to review reports. I had my small radio on, listening to, I believe it was WHUR at the time. The morning show, to be exact. And I'm not really sure what song was playing, but it was interrupted with the news report that it appeared that a plane had crashed into one of the towers in New York. The World Trade Center, and that was approximately 8:46, I believe. And I heard my supervisor say, "Oh, shoot." That's not the word he used, but that's what I heard him yell. I didn't think anything of it because I didn't know he had the news on at the time. I just know he had his monitor on. He always had the monitor on. And when I say monitor, I mean his big screen TV. "9:03. I heard him yell the same thing, but this time he ran out of his office, yelled at me, not in a mean way, but yelled at me to get to the situation room, and he went across the hall and told the staff over there the same thing. However, the civilians or non-essentials, they had to be evacuated. After the second plane hit the other tower, he knew, being former military and just his experience alone, knew that there was something really wrong. So after we assembled in the situation room, there was a monitor in there as well. And I remember the woman who whispered into then President Bush's ear, who was at a school in Sarasota, Florida. And I can just remember the look of shock on his face. And then he addressed everyone that we were under a terrorist attack. Not more than 5 minutes later, did we all watch the Pentagon, which is literally 15, maybe 20 minutes away, engulfed in flames. Now, the Federal Protective Service at that time was tasked to respond to emergencies and reports and crimes of all of the federal buildings in the DC metro area. Now, the Pentagon had its own first responders and police, but anytime you had anything of that magnitude, the Federal Protective Service would partner with them. So SOPs had to be developed within minutes. The police officers, the investigators, the command center, which was in Suitland, Maryland, the Census Bureau, as a matter of fact, was the building. Everybody had to work together. We already knew it was going to be a long day, but we had no idea what was ahead. The majors and lieutenants also came to the situation room. Schedules had to be made. all of our radios had to be placed on a different station for monitoring and making sure that those on a need to know were the only ones able to be on that frequency. I was tasked of manning the situation room. So again, being a rookie and thrown into that was nerve-wracking, but that's usually when I perform my best. Again, the non-essential employees had to be evacuated. And you can imagine with MPD, which also played an integral role in getting civilians, not just from our agency, but all of the agencies in that area out, was almost impossible. The transportation systems closed. You can imagine that Dulles was already closed, and over 4,500 flights, I believe, were ordered to cease because of the attack. After everyone had assembled and assignments were given, a lot of the officers and investigators headed out to the Pentagon. And as I said earlier, the Pentagon already has their own police and first responders, but with the magnitude and the impact, they needed all of the help that was available, and we were stretched extremely thin. Not only that, the infamous Flight 93, which was headed for, or planned to be headed for, the Capitol, which was walking distance for many, but driving distance, I would say a good 5 minutes. And that's where you had the majority of buildings, which would have been even more catastrophic. The heroic passengers on that flight tried their best to divert it, which they did, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough time to get that flight back on track to land safely. And that Flight 93 ended up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania. But that flight definitely was targeted to damage the Capitol of Washington, D.C. The roads were completely to capacity, filled with people who were in horror. The cell phone towers, as you can imagine, were just clogged with so many calls trying to get through, checking on family members who were on flights, family members who reside in New York, family members who work in those buildings and surrounding areas. As the clips I showed earlier, and there were just a few seconds. So fair use was invoked, and it's in my description, or at least it should be, with just a few of the images. And at that time, we were on 16-hour shifts for at least 3 months. And we really didn't have time to absorb everything that was going on, other than ensuring the safety of those in the other buildings, because we did not know if any other attacks were pending and what may have been used. We all know that planes were used as missiles for both towers in New York and the Pentagon. And as I said earlier, what was the next significant target? The U.S. Capitol. Roads were blocked. There were many people, as I said, who could not use public transportation because all of that was cut off. Those that commuted via their own personal vehicles, they also were diverted. So some did not even make it home until the wee hours of the morning. And I specifically remember one lady. Now, there were many, but this particular lady, she was an analyst. And she had 35 years in. She began her career there and ended her career there. She had just put in the day before her retirement package. And due to the fear, chaos, and pandemonium during the evacuation of the Navy Yard, which they had to go down the steps and then outside, and I think the route was down M Street. Yes, it was down M Street, which led into South Capitol Street. And if anyone is familiar with DC, you're on the Maryland line and Virginia. And as I said, after the Pentagon was hit, the 14th Street Bridge also was closed and only available to those first responders. So evacuation routes were almost little to none. Again, I only heard stories of that from those that I know. A good friend of mine who worked at Department of Agriculture, who walked from Department of Agriculture, which was 14th and Independence, all the way to Oxon Hill. I don't know how she did it, but she had grandbabies and she was determined to make it home. As many. But again, being in a situation where we were pretty much cut off from what was really going on the outside. But the lady, Miss Jackson, as I mentioned, had just put in her retirement papers. She was happy and excited about her golden years, so to speak, because I believe she was, if not 60, pretty close to. You wouldn't know it because she was very vibrant. And yes, I used the word was, past tense, because the very next day, we learned that she passed away from a massive heart attack. And I have no doubt it was a direct result of the horror and fear of what we experienced real time. Again, we were working 16-hour shifts and had no clue of any other cells that may have been working and what other means. That could have been or possibly been planned as weapons to continue. We work closely with the JTTF, which is the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So again, we were on a different frequency with our radios, which they're antiquated now, but the old handy dandy Nextel systems. Many people did not get opportunities to see or even talk to family members, and at the time, the cell phone services weren't even working because of the amount of traffic going backwards and forth. So people were not even able to find out the status of their loved one. We couldn't call out. So from September 11th to about November, 16-hour shifts. Intel, building evacuations, interviews. Because as we can remember, or maybe some may remember, one of the terrorists had cleared security at TSA, at Dulles International Airport, which was maybe from the Navy Yard. If you took 395, probably about 30 minutes, I would say. But our goal, as I said, meaning the Federal Protective Service, was to protect all of the federal buildings, the employees in the DC metro area. And again, because of the magnitude, the staff was stretched thin. And you have to keep in mind, those were first responders as well. And while many as you would expect, fled the area to safety. The ones that were able, those brave women and men of the Federal Protective Service, went towards the area. It took days, literally days, for that fire to be completely extinguished. The debris, and this was just from aerial views that we were able to see, is almost surreal when I look back today. And even today, 2022, even though it doesn't affect me as much, I still get an eerie feeling when I hear a plane. Seems odd, but it happens. And it's expected. I had many friends in the New York area who worked at various buildings close by what we know as Ground Zero now, who had family members who in later years passed away due to the pollutants that they had to inhale, the chemicals. For days and months in. At that time, I'm sure they didn't even think that they would endure health issues down the line, but many did. Many that it turned into cancers and other unfortunate health issues, which many succumbed from, and those that did survive are suffering from those ailments as a direct result today. There are many tributes during football, as a matter of fact. The football season had really just begun, as it will for all intents and purposes. The big day for the majority of the games are today, so I'm not sure. I can't imagine that it wouldn't be, but there are many tributes at that time. There were a lot of celebrities and those in the entertainment industry that did their tributes. Again, there are so many documentaries. There are biopics and, again, movies from excerpts of family members. Again, some eyewitnesses close to those locations. And then you have those essential workers who had to field calls from terrified employees or other agencies providing information or requesting information. So it was an extremely stressful time. But we had a good group, an experienced group. Even with experience comes fear. Because again, I cannot stress enough that in certain situations, you're always going to hear some type of chatter. You just don't know the credibility of such chatter. There were reports, and to be prudent and responsible, I can only say there were reports that there was chatter prior to those tragic events. And as a result of the hijacker, hijackers, being able to successfully pass through security at Dulles, new measures have been put in place for the TSA, which is known as the Transportation Security Agency. Training, an exorbitant amount of training and high-tech equipment was used. And even with all of that, there are still ways many people are able to pass through with items that they should not be able to. So they had to rev that up as well. So when we look back on these images, and again, these are just small clips, small little reminders of the evil of September 11th, 2001, which was absolutely planned. Could possibly happen again. There have been subsequent stories, again, of the offspring of those who perished in those flights, who speak about their loved ones and how they will always be heroes to them. And remember, those individuals on the flight, to include the pilot and the flight attendant and the passengers, they boarded the aircraft thinking it was just another day, with no clue that would be their last day. I can't even begin to imagine what they may have felt once it was learned those planes were indeed hijacked. And again, if you go back and research, there have been hundreds of accounts of those witnesses, some experts, and then you have your conspiracy theorists. Those stories will never go away. Those debates will never go away. Nor will the memory of that date that is forever etched as a very ugly stain of one of the most heinous attacks on American soil. Just being who I am, I still have my questions. I have my questions about how so many things are able to be stopped, while in contrast, how some things that should have been known, or perhaps known, but overlooked or maybe not looked at as closely, that quite possibly could avoid it, or perhaps not. I tend to think when information is known or information is shared, you should treat it as relevant and go the extra mile just to check to be sure, especially during that time frame with the already strained relations. So on this day, Sunday, September the 11th, 2022, please keep those first responders, those victims, their loved ones, their families, those who gave the ultimate sacrifice, those that are still suffering from residual effects, not limited to just injuries and illnesses now, but those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder because of what they saw and witnessed, and may still, through nightmares, keep those in your thoughts and prayers, not just today, but every day. And that goes for anyone that have experienced tragic events. But today's broadcast is my remembrance of that day. The day I know I will never forget. And that's only because of what I was tasked to do and because of my work. Tomorrow isn't promised, and I think many should use this day of remembrance to keep that in mind. Because if you check the weather on that day, or you go back and watch some of the documentaries, some of the biopics that I'm sure that will be aired, that was one of the most beautiful weather-wise days in early September of that year. The skies were almost 100% crystal clear. It was an absolutely gorgeous day weather-wise and extremely temperature friendly. A day that started off as normal for many. There were some that spoke later that they were supposed to have gone to work that day, but didn't, for whatever reason. And I'm not going to say they were lucky, because nobody was lucky that day. Everybody was affected either indirectly or directly. So when you're blessed with another day, no matter what your beliefs are, it will behoove you to give thanks or to acknowledge. It isn't promised. It wasn't promised to any of those on those flights, in those buildings, those in close proximity, nor those first responders. Enjoy your Sunday. Be safe, be well, and be healthier.